She fixed his car with grease under her nails and a secret buried in her chest. And when the most dangerous man in the city tried to hand her $1 million, she looked him dead in the eye and said no. If this story touches you, please support our channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing it with someone you care about. Jessica Miller runs a small garage on the edge of town, the same one her father built with his own hands. Nothing about it is fancy, just oil stains on concrete, tools hanging from rusted hooks, and an old radio that only picks up static half the time. But it belongs to her. Every morning she opens those doors before sunrise, because bills don't wait and neither does rent. Her father, Daniel Miller, taught her everything about engines. He used to say a car never lies to you. If something's wrong, it'll show you, you just have to listen. She didn't understand back then how much that lesson would apply to people too. 4 years ago, Daniel died in what police called an accident. A quiet road he'd driven 1,000 times, late at night, no witnesses. Case closed, they said. But something about it never sat right with Jessica. Her father was careful, cautious. The kind of man who checked his mirrors twice before pulling out of a driveway. Accidents like that didn't happen to men like him. She buried that doubt for years. Grief has a way of making a person question everything, so she convinced herself she was imagining things. Instead, she focused on keeping the garage alive, working double shifts, turning wrenches until her hands ached, just trying to hold on to the one thing her father left behind. It's worth understanding something before the story continues. Jessica wasn't looking for trouble. She wasn't chasing danger or excitement. She was simply a woman trying to survive, one repair at a time, in a world that had already taken everything else from her. Then came the night that changed all of it. It was close to midnight when the sound of engines broke the silence outside. Not one car, but 3, black and silent, pulling up right in front of the shop. Jessica wiped her hands on her jeans, wondering who could possibly need a mechanic that late. When she stepped outside, she saw men in dark suits stepping out of the vehicles, eyes scanning the street like they were expecting trouble. Then she saw him. The man in the back seat sat calm and composed, watching her the way someone studies a puzzle they already know the answer to. She didn't know his name yet, but she could feel it in the air. This wasn't an ordinary breakdown, and he wasn't an ordinary customer. Jessica had no idea that night would pull threads she'd spent years trying to ignore. She had no idea that fixing his car would eventually lead her straight back to her father's death, and the truth she'd been too afraid to face. But that's where this story really begins. Jessica was 8 years old the first time her father let her hold a wrench that weighed almost as much as her arm. Daniel Miller crouched beside her in the same garage she runs today, guiding her small hands toward a loose bolt, patient in a way most grown men weren't with kids who asked too many questions. She remembers the smell of motor oil mixing with his aftershave, the sound of the radio playing old country songs while he worked, and the way he'd hum along even when he didn't know the words. Daniel wasn't a man who talked much, but when he did, his words stuck. He told her once that money could disappear overnight, but a person's word was the only thing that stayed with them forever. At the time, she thought it was just something fathers said to sound wise. Years later, that same sentence would feel like a warning she never understood in time. Her mother, Carol Miller, passed away when Jessica was barely 6, leaving a quiet sadness in the house that never fully went away. Daniel rarely spoke about her, but sometimes Jessica would catch him staring at an old photo on the workbench, lost somewhere far from the garage. He never remarried, never brought anyone else into their small world. It was just the two of them, held together by grease-stained hands and unspoken grief. Ethan Walsh became part of that world not long after. A mechanic a few years younger than Daniel, he started working alongside him when Jessica was still in elementary school. Ethan had an easy laugh and a habit of sneaking her candy bars when Daniel wasn't looking. He treated her less like a customer's kid and more like a little sister, teaching her how to check tire pressure long before she could reach the pedals of a car herself. Those afternoons in the garage, surrounded by both men, felt like the safest place in the world. But safety, Jessica would later realize, is sometimes just a feeling that hasn't been tested yet. She remembers one night clearly even now. She was maybe 11, half asleep on the office couch while her father closed up the shop. The phone rang, sharp and sudden in the quiet. Daniel picked it up expecting a customer, but his face changed the moment he heard the voice on the other end. His shoulders went stiff. His jaw tightened. He turned away from her, lowering his voice to almost a whisper, glancing toward the window like someone might be watching from outside. She didn't understand the conversation. She barely remembers the words at all. What she remembers is the fear on his face, something she had never seen on him before and rarely saw again. When he hung up, he forced a smile, told her it was nothing, and sent her home early that night. As a child, she let it go the way children do when adults promise everything is fine. But now, years later, that memory keeps resurfacing uninvited, playing on a loop she can't seem to turn off. Somehow, that one phone call feels like the first thread in a story she's only beginning to understand. A knock on the door changed everything. The evening, 2 police officers stood on the porch, hats in hand, faces carrying the kind of practiced sympathy that told Jessica something was terribly wrong before they even spoke. They said her father's truck had gone off the road on Miller's Pass, the same stretch he'd driven thousands of times without a single scratch. They called it an accident. They said he lost control. They said it like it was simple. But nothing about it felt simple to her. Daniel didn't speed. He didn't drink. He checked his tires every week and kept his truck in better condition than most dealerships kept theirs. A road he could drive with his eyes closed wasn't the kind of place he'd lose control on, not without a reason no one was giving her. The funeral came fast, too fast, filled with faces from town who spoke in hushed, careful tones. People hugged her tightly and said he was a good man, that the town wouldn't be the same without him. She stood there numb, barely hearing any of it, watching the casket like it belonged to someone else's life instead of her own. It didn't take long for the second blow to land. Within weeks, letters started arriving, addressed to her father, demanding payments on debts she never knew existed. Unfamiliar names, unfamiliar numbers, threats disguised as polite reminders. The garage, once a symbol of stability, suddenly felt like it was standing on ground that could crumble any moment. Ethan refused to let her handle it alone. He showed up every morning despite everything stacked against her, helping her keep the doors open and the customers coming. He never asked for anything in return, just quietly filled the space left behind, becoming the one steady presence in a world that had turned upside down overnight. Around town, whispers started circling, the kind people only share when they think you're not listening. Some said her father had gotten mixed up with people he shouldn't have, that his debts weren't as innocent as they seemed. Others simply shook their heads and changed the subject whenever his name came up, as if saying too much might invite trouble to their own doorstep. She heard those whispers, but she was still too heartbroken to chase after answers no one wanted to give her. Grief, she told herself, was twisting her thoughts, making her suspicious of things that were simply tragic and nothing more. It was easier to accept the official story than to imagine something darker had been hiding underneath it. So she buried the questions deep, the same way she buried her doubts about that late-night phone call years earlier. For a long time, she convinced herself that was the end of it, a story with a sad but ordinary ending. She had no idea how wrong she was. The garage looked mostly the same, but everything around it had changed. Ethan eventually had to step away, taking a steady job across town to support his growing family, leaving Jessica to run the place alone for the first time in her life. She didn't blame him. Bills didn't care about loyalty, and he had mouths to feed that couldn't survive on the unpredictable income of a struggling repair shop. Those years blurred together in a haze of exhaustion. She fixed transmissions for barely enough to cover rent, patched brakes for neighbors who paid in installments, and stretched every dollar until it nearly snapped. Sleep became a luxury sandwiched between paperwork and oil changes. There were nights she sat alone in the office long after closing, staring at numbers that never quite added up in her favor. Strange faces started appearing more often, men who didn't come for repairs but lingered near the entrance, watching the shop like they were keeping tabs on something. A few made vague comments about her father, dropping his name with a tone that felt more like a threat than a memory. She learned to nod politely and say nothing, sensing these weren't people worth questioning. It was during this stretch that she made the mistake of trusting Gary Holt, a smooth-talking man who convinced her he could handle the garage's finances better than she could on her own. He seemed dependable at first, organized and confident, easing a burden she desperately needed lifted. She handed him access to accounts, invoices, everything that kept the business breathing. Months later, she discovered he'd been quietly draining funds the entire time, moving money into accounts she couldn't trace, until one morning he simply vanished without a word. What he left behind wasn't just empty accounts, but a mountain of debt threatening to swallow the one thing she had left of her father. The betrayal cut deeper than the financial loss itself. It confirmed something she'd been resisting for years, that trust was a door better left closed. After that, she stopped letting people get close. Customers came and went, but she kept conversations short, guarded, transactional. Friendships faded into polite distance. Even Ethan noticed the shift in her, though he never pushed too hard, respecting the walls she'd built brick by brick. By the time 3 black SUVs pulled up outside her garage that midnight, engines dead and silent, Jessica wasn't the same person who once feared unfamiliar faces. She had already lost her father, her sense of safety, and the last person she trusted with anything that mattered. There was nothing left for anyone to take from her that hadn't already been taken. That's exactly why, when armed men stepped out of those vehicles and a stranger's name was whispered like a warning, fear never found its way into her chest. She had nothing left to protect except the one thing no one could steal, her own resolve. The shop had gone quiet for the night, lights dimmed except for one bulb hanging over the workbench. Jessica was locking up the last cabinet when the sound of engines cut through the silence outside, low and heavy, nothing like the usual traffic that passed this late. She glanced through the window and froze for half a second, watching 3 black SUVs roll to a stop right in front of the garage. Doors opened almost in unison. Men stepped out first, dressed sharp, moving with the kind of discipline that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with training. She counted 4 of them before she even registered what she was looking at, each one scanning the street like they expected trouble to arrive before they did. Her instincts told her to stay inside, lock the door, wait it out. But something else took over instead, a strange calm that came from having already lost too much to be afraid of losing more. She wiped her hands on a rag, stepped outside, and walked straight toward the vehicles despite one of the men raising a hand, telling her to stop right there. She kept walking anyway. The rear window of the lead SUV rolled down slowly, revealing a man seated with a stillness that felt almost unnatural. He wasn't shouting orders or glancing around nervously like the others. He simply watched her, calm and composed, studying her the way someone studies a problem they already suspect they know the solution to. Later she'd learn his name was Victor Russo, though in that moment he was just a stranger radiating quiet danger. He explained the engine had died without warning, no clear reason, no warning lights. She didn't ask questions about who he was or why armed men surrounded a broken-down car. She simply asked him to pop the hood and got to work, ignoring the tension thick enough to touch. As she worked, she could feel his eyes on her the entire time, not in the way most people stared, but with quiet calculation, as though he was testing more than just her mechanical skill. She checked the battery, traced a loose connection, and adjusted a corroded wire with practiced hands, refusing to let the pressure rush her into a mistake. Less than an hour later, the engine roared back to life, steady and smooth. She stepped back, wiped the grease from her palms with the same rag she carried outside, and turned to face him without flinching. Most people who met Victor Russo looked away first. Jessica didn't. She held his gaze evenly, offering no fear and no false politeness, just the quiet confidence of someone who had already survived worse nights than this one. For a moment, something flickered behind his composed expression, something that looked almost like surprise. Whatever test that midnight breakdown had been, she had no idea she'd just passed the first part of it. Days passed before Victor returned, this time without the convoy, without the armed men lining the street. Just one black car parked quietly outside, and him stepping out alone, carrying a briefcase that looked far too ordinary for what it contained. He walked into the garage like he already owned the place, setting the briefcase on her cluttered desk without a word of greeting. When he opened it, stacks of cash sat neatly arranged inside, more money than she had ever seen outside of movies. He said it was a token of appreciation, nothing more, a simple thank you for a simple repair. Jessica stared at the money longer than she meant to. $1 million sitting inches away from her hands could erase everything Gary Holt left behind, every debt collector's call, every sleepless night spent staring at numbers that refused to balance. For one brief moment, she let herself imagine what it would feel like to breathe without that weight crushing her chest. But her father's voice found its way into her thoughts before she could reach for it. She remembered him saying that men who gave without reason always expected something greater in return eventually, even if they didn't say it out loud. Victor hadn't survived in his world by giving things away freely. This wasn't gratitude sitting on her desk. It was a test, wrapped carefully in generosity. She closed the briefcase and slid it back across the table toward him. Victor's expression barely shifted, though something in his eyes sharpened, like he hadn't expected that response from anyone. He asked her plainly why she'd refuse money that could clearly change her circumstances overnight. She told him the truth without hesitation, that her father raised her to believe money taken without understanding its cost always came back to collect more than it gave. For a moment, silence settled between them, heavy and unfamiliar in a room usually filled with the hum of machinery. Then she surprised even herself by speaking again, asking for something entirely different instead. She told him about the loan sharks circling her neighborhood, the fear residents lived with quietly, the crime that had slowly suffocated the streets she grew up on. She asked him to make that stop, not with cash, but with the kind of influence a man like him clearly carried. Victor studied her carefully, longer this time, as though recalculating everything he'd assumed walking through that door. Few people ever asked him for anything beyond money, and fewer still asked for something that cost him more than a stack of bills ever could. He didn't answer right away. He simply closed the briefcase himself, nodded once, and told her it would be handled. Something shifted in his expression before he left, subtle but unmistakable, like she had revealed a part of himself he wasn't used to feeling. A week later, two of Victor's men stopped by the garage, this time without formality, just checking that the neighborhood arrangement was holding as promised. Jessica offered them coffee out of habit more than hospitality, half listening as they talked between themselves about routes and schedules that meant nothing to her. Then one name slipped out in casual conversation, mentioned so briefly the other man barely reacted to it. Marcus Doyle. Her hands went still around the coffee pot. That name wasn't unfamiliar to her, though she couldn't immediately place why it felt like a stone dropping into her stomach. The men left shortly after, unaware they'd handed her a thread she couldn't ignore. That night, she sat awake long after closing the shop, mind circling back to old boxes stored in the garage's back room, ones she'd sealed away after her father's funeral and never found the courage to open again. Grief made some things easier to bury than face, and those boxes had become a graveyard of memories she wasn't ready to disturb. But now, curiosity outweighed fear. She pulled the boxes out one by one, sorting through faded invoices, receipts, and scattered paperwork that smelled like dust and old motor oil. Halfway through the second box, she found it, an invoice with Marcus Doyle's signature scrawled across the bottom, dated just months before her father's death. Attached to it were notes in her father's handwriting, cautious and coded, mentioning meetings she never knew existed. Her chest tightened as pieces started shifting into place. This wasn't just a random name spoken in passing. Somehow, her father's final months were tangled with the same world Victor Russo now moved through effortlessly. Unable to carry that weight alone, she reached out to Ethan, the only person left she trusted enough to confide in. She showed him the invoice, watching his face carefully as recognition flickered across it. He didn't look surprised the way she expected. Instead, unease settled over him, the kind that comes from knowing more than you're willing to say out loud. He hesitated before speaking, choosing his words like they might detonate something if handled wrong. He admitted he'd heard whispers years ago, nothing concrete, just rumors about her father getting tangled with dangerous people shortly before the accident. He'd stayed quiet back then, hoping it was nothing, not wanting to hand a grieving teenager one more burden to carry. That night, lying awake long after Ethan left, Jessica made a decision that terrified her more than anything Victor's men ever could. Instead of walking away from this world, she would step closer into it, following whatever thread connected her father to Marcus Doyle, no matter where it led. She had spent years accepting an explanation that never made sense. Now, for the first time, she had a name, a direction, and a reason to finally stop pretending grief alone could explain what happened that night on Miller's Pass. Piecing the full picture together took patience Jessica didn't know she had. Through careful questions, old contacts of her father's who still remembered him fondly, and fragments Ethan reluctantly helped confirm, the truth finally surfaced, uglier and clearer than she ever imagined. Marcus Doyle had approached her father years earlier, offering him a deal disguised as simple business, using the garage to move money that never should have passed through honest hands. Daniel refused immediately, unwilling to let his shop become a front for something he despised. That refusal, quiet and firm, was enough to seal his fate in a world where saying no carried consequences most people never saw coming. The accident on Miller's Pass wasn't an accident at all. Marcus arranged it himself, acting without Victor's knowledge or approval, eliminating a problem quietly before it could grow into something bigger. To the outside world, it remained a tragedy explained away by bad luck and a quiet road. To Jessica, it became the final answer to a question that had haunted her for years. That late-night phone call from her childhood suddenly made painful sense. The fear on her father's face wasn't paranoia or overreaction. He'd been threatened directly, likely told exactly what would happen if he didn't cooperate, and he chose to protect her from that fear instead of burdening her with it. Sitting alone in the garage office that night, she let herself feel everything at once. Grief crashing into vindication tangled with a rage she didn't know she was capable of holding. Her father hadn't died from carelessness. He died holding on to the exact principle he spent his life teaching her, choosing integrity over money even when it cost him everything. Suddenly, every unfamiliar face that circled the garage over the years, every debt collector who seemed to know too much, every whispered warning from strangers made sense. They weren't random threats. They were echoes of a man who'd been silenced for refusing to bend. What unsettled her most wasn't just uncovering the truth, but realizing Marcus Doyle hadn't disappeared afterward. He still operated comfortably within Victor's organization, protected by loyalty and years of unquestioned service, hidden in plain sight within the very world she now found herself tangled in. For a long moment she considered walking away, taking what she'd learned and burying it the way she'd buried everything else for years. It would be safer. Easier. No one would blame her for choosing silence over confrontation with a man capable of what Marcus had done. But safety had never brought her peace, only slow suffocation disguised as survival. Instead, she made a decision that settled deep in her chest, calm and unshakable. She wouldn't run from what she now knew. She wouldn't bury it in another sealed box, waiting years to face it again. She would use it, carefully and deliberately, to finally give her father the justice silence had denied him for far too long. Jessica requested a meeting with Victor directly, something she never imagined doing willingly. Going to the police wasn't an option, not with evidence buried this deep and connections stretching further than any local department could touch. If justice existed for her father, it wouldn't come from a courtroom. It would come from the same world that took him. Victor agreed to see her at a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of the city, away from prying eyes. She arrived carrying a folder instead of fear, laying old invoices and her father's coded notes across the table between them. She walked him through the timeline slowly, connecting dates, names and details until the picture became impossible to misread. She watched him carefully as she spoke, expecting the same unreadable calm he always carried. Instead, something shifted behind his eyes as Marcus Doyle's name repeated itself through the evidence, tying directly to the death of a mechanic who once refused to launder money through his own garage. Victor's jaw tightened. For the first time since she'd met him, his composure cracked, replaced by something colder and far more dangerous. Marcus wasn't just an associate to him. He was someone Victor had trusted for years, someone who stood beside him through countless decisions, now revealed as a man who'd acted alone to eliminate an innocent life without permission or reason beyond greed. Jessica hadn't come seeking violence. She made that clear, telling him plainly that she only wanted the truth acknowledged, not buried any deeper than it already had been. But she also understood the world Victor operated in didn't deal in courtrooms or apologies. Loyalty came with rules, and breaking those rules carried consequences far beyond anything she controlled. Victor sat quietly for a long moment, processing everything laid before him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard from him before. He told her that her father's refusal to compromise, the same integrity that clearly ran through her, was exactly why he'd respected her from the moment she pushed his money back across that table. He hadn't realized then that he was measuring her against the very standard that cost her father his life. There was a strange irony sitting heavy between them, one neither needed to say out loud. The same principle that made Daniel dangerous to men like Marcus was the principle that had earned Jessica quiet respect from a man just as feared. Victor didn't make promises that night. He simply gathered the documents, thanked her for bringing this forward, and told her the matter would be handled internally, the way things were always handled in his world. Marcus Doyle wasn't seen publicly again after that. No headlines followed, no explanations offered, just silence where his presence used to be. For Jessica, that silence spoke loudly enough. A debt years in the making had finally been settled, not through revenge she sought herself, but through consequences that caught up exactly where they belonged. These days the garage looks different, though nothing about it feels dishonest. Steady work fills the schedule now, legitimate contracts and fair-paying customers finding their way to her door through channels she never had to question twice. Victor never mentioned sending business her way directly, but she recognized his quiet influence the moment reliable clients started replacing the desperate scramble for rent money. Debt no longer hangs over every decision she makes. It didn't disappear through stolen cash or a briefcase she never accepted. It disappeared slowly through honest work finally paying what it was worth, free from loan sharks circling the block or unfamiliar men dropping veiled threats between routine conversations. Looking back, she still thinks about that $1 million sometimes, sitting inches from her hands that quiet afternoon. Turning it down felt terrifying in the moment, like walking away from the only lifeline she'd ever been offered. But what she gained instead couldn't have come wrapped in cash. She gained the truth about her father, an answer that finally let her grieve him properly instead of questioning him for years. Ethan never left her side through any of it, and today his name sits right beside hers on the garage sign, a full partner rather than just a loyal friend filling gaps left by others. Where trust failed her repeatedly, through Gary Holt's betrayal and years of learning to expect disappointment, Ethan remained the one constant that never wavered. She thinks often about her father's voice, the same lesson repeated throughout her childhood about integrity mattering more than money. For years, that lesson felt almost naive, something easier to admire than actually live by, especially while drowning in debt with a fortune sitting within reach. But refusing that briefcase, standing firm exactly when it would have been easier to fold, became the decision that eventually unraveled everything, leading her straight back to the justice her father never received. Had she taken the money that day, she might have solved her financial troubles temporarily, but she would have lost the one thread that eventually exposed Marcus Doyle and gave her father's death the meaning it deserved. Sometimes the hardest choice isn't the one that cost the most upfront, but the one that protects something money was never capable of buying in the first place. She doesn't consider herself brave or extraordinary. She simply refused to abandon the values her father spent his life teaching her, even when abandoning them would have been far easier. To anyone listening to her story, she wants them to understand one thing clearly. Integrity rarely feels rewarding in the moment it's tested. It often feels like sacrifice, like walking away from something you desperately need. But sometimes choosing what's right over what's easy becomes the exact thing that saves you, long after you've stopped expecting anything to save you at all.